A church decides it isn't comfortable with firearms on its safety ministry. That's understandable. Then someone offers what sounds like the perfect compromise. What about something non-lethal? Pepper spray, a taser, maybe some other tool that gives the team a way to stop somebody without using deadly force. It sounds like the safer option, but there's a problem with that phrase. There really isn't a non-lethal option. There are only the options designed to be less lethal. And that one word, less, changes the entire conversation. That's what we're talking about today.
If God is for me, who's against me? Nobody is. I'm so sick of the...
Welcome to Sanctuary Peacemakers. This is your frontline guide to safety and security inside houses of worship with your host, Unity. Now, let's enter the crucible of our discussion.
Welcome back to Sanctuary Peacemakers. Before we get started, make sure you're following the podcast for new episodes every Thursday. If this episode is helpful, leave a comment, rating, or review, and share it with someone involved in church safety ministry. When we talk about defensive tools in church safety, firearms tend to dominate the conversation. Some churches allow armed safety ministry members, others don't. Some pastors are comfortable with firearms in the church, while others want absolutely nothing to do with them. That's a decision each church has to make based on its circumstances, beliefs, applicable laws, and the people serving in its ministry. But somewhere in that conversation, less lethal options often come up as a compromise. And I understand why. If leadership isn't comfortable with firearms, but also recognizes that the safety ministry members may someday have to deal with a violent person, something like pepper spray can sound like a reasonable middle ground. Maybe a conducted electrical weapon, commonly known by the brand name taser, sounds like another possibility. The problem begins when we start thinking of those options as harmless. They're not. The term less lethal exists for a reason. These tools are designed to reduce the likelihood of causing death compared with firearms. Reduce is the important word. They can still cause injury. In rare circumstances, serious medical complications can occur. Their use can still result in police investigation, and a church or volunteer can still face civil litigation afterwards. That doesn't mean less lethal tools are bad. It simply means we need to be honest about what they are. One of the clearest examples in a church environment is pepper spray. Imagine someone becomes physically aggressive in the middle of your sanctuary. There are people standing only a few feet away. Someone on the safety ministry pulls out a traditional aerosol OC spray and deploys it. The person creating the problem may be affected. So might everybody else around them. Now you potentially have people coughing, struggling to see, trying to get away from the area, and wondering what's happening. That's very different from using the same tool outdoors. And that's why environment matters. One alternative, sometimes considered, is OC gel. Instead of creating the same type of airborne cloud, gel is projected in a more concentrated stream. That can reduce the likelihood of contaminating everybody nearby. Notice I said reduce, not eliminate. There can still be problems with deployment, proximity, airflow, and contamination. The point isn't that every church should carry OC gel, The point is, if your church decides to authorize a tool, you need to think beyond whether that tool works. You need to think about where you're going to use it. A church isn't an empty training room. There may be children nearby. There may be elderly members. Someone may have asthma or another respiratory condition. People may be packed closely together. A tool that seems relatively simple can become much more complicated once you put it into that environment. Conducted electrical weapons create a different set of considerations. They can provide an option for temporarily incapacitating somebody without immediately resorting to deadly force, but they're not magic. They can fail. Heavy clothing can interfere with effectiveness. Probe placement matters. Distance matters. The circumstances of the confrontation matter. That's something every safety ministry needs to understand about any defensive tool. What happens when it doesn't work? If your entire plan depends on one tool working exactly as expected, you don't really have a plan. That becomes especially important when the threat becomes deadly. Sometimes people think about the use of force as a staircase. You start at the bottom and you move up one step at a time. First you talk, then you physically intervene, then you use a less lethal tool. Only after you've tried those things do you move to deadly force. Real life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes the staircase just disappears. If someone walks into a sanctuary actively shooting people, you're not required to work your way through every lesser option while people are being killed. At the same time, someone being disruptive or even physically aggressive doesn't automatically justify deadly force. The response has to fit the circumstances. That's why I don't like the idea of treating less lethal tools as simply another box to check. The tool doesn't make the decision for you. You have to recognize what's happening. You still have to understand what level of force is appropriate. And as we discussed in the previous episode, you need to understand the laws that apply where you live. That's especially important when we start talking about restraints. Handcuffs look simple. Most of us have seen police officers use them countless times on television, and that can create the impression that putting someone in handcuffs is just another way of controlling a difficult person. But once you restrain someone and prevent them from leaving, you've entered an entirely different legal situation. Safety ministry members are not police officers simply because they're serving their church. The authority of a private citizen to detain another person varies depending on the law and the circumstances. That is something a church needs to understand before putting handcuffs on someone's equipment belt. There are also physical risks involved with restraints. Improper application can cause injury, particularly if someone continues struggling. So once again, something that looks simple isn't necessarily simple. Impact weapons raise similar concerns for me. A baton can cause significant injury when it's used improperly, and using one means getting close enough to another person for that person to potentially grab it. That doesn't make a baton inherently wrong, but I would have serious reservations about handing one to a volunteer who doesn't have substantial training and then assuming we've made the ministry safer. And that brings me to something I think gets overlooked whenever we start adding equipment. Training time is limited. Most church safety ministry members are volunteers. They have jobs, they have families, and they have responsibilities outside of church. There are only so many hours available for training. Every tool you add creates something else that people need to remain competent with. If someone carries a tool but rarely trains with it, I have to ask whether we've really added a capability or whether we've simply added another piece of equipment. Those aren't necessarily the same thing. I'd rather have a ministry that understands its limitations than one that has an answer hanging from somebody's belt for every imaginable situation. There's also an optics issue here, too. Safety ministry members aren't law enforcement. We need to remember that. Somebody carrying a radio and whatever defensive equipment the church has determined appropriate may already project a certain amount of authority. But as we continue adding equipment, there comes a point where a volunteer can begin to look more like a police officer than a church safety ministry member. And that can affect how people in the congregation perceive them. It can also create confusion when actual law enforcement arrives during an emergency. The goal isn't to look intimidating, the goal is to be capable. Those are very different things. None of this means I oppose less lethal options. I don't. I think they can have a place, but they don't have every place. That's the distinction. There may be circumstances where a properly trained person using an appropriate less lethal option can resolve a dangerous situation without resorting to deadly force, and that is valuable. But there are also situations where the tool isn't appropriate, isn't effective, or simply isn't enough for the threat being faced. One of the mistakes we can make is choosing less lethal tools because they make us feel more comfortable. A church may be uncomfortable talking about firearms, so pepper spray or a taser feels easier. But our comfort level doesn't change the nature of the threat. If someone enters your church with a rifle and begins shooting, pepper spray isn't an equivalent response simply because leadership feels more comfortable with it. That's not an argument that every church safety ministry needs to carry firearms. It's an argument for being honest about what your chosen tools can and cannot accomplish. If a church decides it will not have an armed response, that is that church's decision. But leadership should make that decision understanding what it means. The same should be true when less lethal tools are authorized. Don't authorize something simply because it sounds safer. Understand the tool, its limitations, the environment in which it might be used, and understand the legal implications. And make sure the people carrying it actually know how to use it. There's also the question of what happens afterward. Using a less lethal tool doesn't necessarily end the incident. Somebody may be injured. Law enforcement may need to become involved. Medical attention may be necessary. The church may need to preserve evidence and document what occurred. That is why less lethal equipment can't simply be purchased and handed out. It has to exist inside a larger plan, and that plan should include the church's leadership. It should include the safety ministry. It should take applicable law into account, and the church should understand what its insurance carrier expects. If necessary, legal counsel should be involved before policies are established. That may sound like a lot of work for something as simple as carrying pepper spray, but that's exactly the point. It isn't always as simple as it looks. I think the phrase less lethal can unintentionally lower our guard. It sounds measured and responsible. It sounds like we've found the safe middle ground between doing nothing and using deadly force. And sometimes it may be that middle ground. Sometimes it may give a trained safety ministry member exactly the option they need to resolve a situation. But simply choosing a less lethal tool does not automatically make a ministry safer. The tool still has to be appropriate for the environment, and the person carrying it still has to be trained. And the decision to use it still has to be reasonable. And leadership still has to accept the responsibility for putting that tool into the ministry. That's really what this conversation is about, not the gear. Responsibility. Before adding another tool to your safety ministry, don't ask, could this help us? Ask whether your people can use it competently and whether it actually makes sense for the situations you're preparing to face. Sometimes the answers will be yes. Sometimes the responsible answer will be no. And that's okay. The responsibility of leadership isn't to choose whatever feels safer. It's to choose what actually protects.
Fear you are not welcome here.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Sanctuary Peacemakers. If today's conversation added value, be sure to tune in next week as we continue equipping and encouraging those who serve and protect houses of worship. A special thanks to Haley Jones for granting permission to use her song Not Today as our introduction, and to Leslie Jones for allowing us to use the song Sound Mind as our outro music. As always, y'all stay safe and y'all stay blessed.